Malaysia is supposed to be one of the great success stories of Southeast Asia. It's got the Petronas Twin Towers, Formula One history, one of the most biodiverse rainforests on the planet, a food culture so good that people who've never visited will tell you they dream about the nasi lemak and the char kway teow. It ranks second in Southeast Asia on the Oxford Economic Paper's Global Cities Index. It was named among the top retirement destinations in the world for years running. Every Places to Live Abroad listicle from the last decade has Malaysia near the top, usually with language like hidden gem and best kept secret and incredible value. You've read those articles. You've maybe bookmarked them. But here's what those articles aren't telling you. The people who actually live in Malaysia, the young Malaysians who were born there, educated there, and theoretically had every reason to build their lives there, are leaving. Not in a trickle, in a flood. And they've been leaving for decades, and the reasons they're leaving are the same reasons they always were, and the government knows it, and the studies confirm it, and almost nothing meaningful has been done to stop it. That's the story. Not the skyline, not the rankings. The quiet, persistent, compounding exodus of the people Malaysia needs most. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they're genuinely alarming. Approximately 1.86 million Malaysians have left the country in the past 5 decades. That sounds like a long time, but run the math. That's 5.6% of the total population gone. The global average for this kind of skilled migration is 3.6%. Malaysia is running at more than 1.5 times the global rate. 1 in every 10 skilled Malaysians born in the country chooses to leave. That's twice the world average. And before you say, that's just how it works in small open economies like Singapore and Hong Kong. No, Malaysia isn't a city-state. It's a country of 34 million people with substantial natural resources, a functioning manufacturing base, and a developing service economy. It doesn't have the excuse of being tiny. A government study released in early 2024 found that 1.13 million out of those 1.86 million Malaysians abroad are living in a single country, Singapore, just next door. Same cuisine, similar climate, but radically different paychecks and career prospects. Of the Malaysians working in Singapore, 39% hold skilled jobs. In Brunei, 68% of the Malaysian diaspora is classified as skilled. The Malaysian government's own Department of Statistics called this out, officially, as having financial ramifications since a significant portion of those employed abroad originated from the Malaysian education system. Translation: Malaysia trains them, and Singapore, Australia, the UK, and the United States cash in on that investment. Now, let's talk about why. Because it's not complicated. It's not mysterious. It's not some deep sociological puzzle. It comes down to a number that every fresh Malaysian graduate knows and can tell you in about 4 seconds. A computer science graduate in the United States starts at around $50,000 a year. The same degree in Malaysia starts at barely $10,000. And yes, cost of living is lower in Malaysia, but not 5 times lower. Adjust for purchasing power all you want, the gap is still massive, and it only gets worse as careers advance and you start thinking about a mortgage. Over 70% of working graduates in Malaysia earn below 2,000 ringgit per month. That's roughly $430. In 2024, salary projections remained essentially flat. Analysts were forecasting roughly 5% salary increases while the ringgit was depreciating and the cost of living was rising faster than paychecks. The employee share of national income sits at around 33% of GDP. The government's own target is 40 to 45%. They're not meeting it, and household debt has climbed to 84.3% of GDP as of early 2025, one of the highest ratios in Asia, because people are borrowing to stay afloat, not to build wealth. Almost 64% of Malaysians are either financially unstable or living paycheck to paycheck. That statistic isn't from some opposition think tank. It's from the Institute for Capital Market Research Malaysia. So when a talented 26-year-old Malaysian engineer gets a LinkedIn message from a recruiter in Singapore or Sydney offering triple the ringgit salary, the decision isn't hard. The decision takes about 48 hours. Here's where it gets interesting, because the brain drain story in Malaysia isn't just about money. It never was. The Khazanah Research Institute, the World Bank, Talent Corp, every credible institution that has studied this agrees on something that the government is deeply reluctant to address head-on: A substantial portion of the emigration, particularly among non-Bumiputera Malaysians, the ethnic Chinese and Indian communities, is driven not just by economics, but by a perception, backed by decades of lived experience, of structural inequality. Public university enrollment operates on racial quotas. Government contracts tilt toward Bumiputera companies under the new economic policy and its successors. Promotions in the civil service, scholarships for elite programs, priority access to subsidized housing, all of it weighted by ethnicity. Professor James Chin, director of the Asia Institute at the University of Tasmania, put it plainly. For non-Bumiputera Malaysians, the main issue is the perceived discrimination faced in all aspects of Malaysian life. One professional who left said this in a published interview. "I believe it will take at least 10 years before Malaysia can shed the racial differences, cronyism, corruption, and be able to offer equal opportunity to all. Till then, I intend to raise my family here." He was talking about Australia. And he said it without bitterness. Just clarity. When you build a system that tells some of your most qualified people that the ceiling is lower for them than for others, don't be surprised when they find a country without that ceiling. Let's be real about what this costs. The EMIR research think tank estimated that the talent drain is lowering Malaysia's GDP growth by 2%. 2% of GDP. Gone quietly, not from a disaster or a recession or a market crash, but from a slow, structural failure to retain the people the country spent its education budget developing. The healthcare sector is hollowed out. The tech industry struggles to keep pace globally. The government created Talent Corp specifically to address this in 2011, over a decade ago, with a returning expert program and various diaspora engagement initiatives. Since 2011, roughly 4,000 Malaysians have returned through that program in over a decade of operation. 4,000 against 1.86 million abroad. The math does not work. And the 2024 to 2025 survey data found that 32% of the Malaysian workforce still intended to seek a pay raise, meaning widespread, documented dissatisfaction with current wage levels. They're not leaving because they hate Malaysia. Most of them are homesick. Most of them miss the food and the family and the familiarity. They're leaving because the system has not given them a compelling economic reason to stay, and half measures and repatriation fares are not going to fix a structural problem. Now let's talk about the people who stay, because the brain drain doesn't just affect the ones who leave. It reshapes the entire landscape for the Malaysians who remain, and that landscape increasingly looks like a housing market that is quietly crushing an entire generation. House prices in Malaysia grew at a compound annual rate of 26.5% between 2002 and 2014. Income over that same period grew by 11.7%, not a misprint, prices compounding at more than double the rate of income growth for over a decade. By 2016, home prices were 2.4 times higher than they were in 2000, and property values continue to increase at around 6 to 8% annually, while salary increments run about 2%. So every year the gap widens. Every year the down payment you need grows faster than your savings can catch it. Using the United Nations and World Bank benchmark, the multiple median approach, which says housing is unaffordable when it costs more than 3 times annual household income. Malaysian housing scores over 5.0 nationally, well above the affordability threshold. And surveys show that only 24 to 28% of Malaysian households find current housing prices truly acceptable. 3/4 of the country thinks their housing market is unaffordable. That's not a fringe view. That's the mainstream view, because it's the correct view. More Malaysian millennials are dropping their home ownership dreams entirely. The research shows younger Malaysians are deliberately choosing to rent, not because they want to, but because the locations they can actually afford to buy are too far from their jobs to be livable. The maintenance fees add another layer of cost, and personal loans from weddings and education have already consumed their credit capacity. An entire generation is being locked out of the primary wealth-building mechanism that previous generations used to achieve middle-class stability. And here's the compounding tragedy of it. The property market has a surplus. There are 23,515 completed but unsold residential units sitting empty in Malaysia as of Q1 2025, worth 15 billion ringgit. The office vacancy rate in the Kuala Lumpur CBD is nearly 20%. The country is simultaneously building too much of what people can't afford and too little of what they need. Developers chase the margins in luxury and upper-mid condominiums, leaving the sub-500,000 ringgit segment underserved and the people in that income bracket locked in renting cycles that eat into retirement savings. The government's answer has been affordable housing programs with application backlogs measured in years, lottery systems that leave qualified applicants waiting half a decade, and financing mechanisms that extend loan terms so long that the Khazanah Research Institute is now warning that some proposals would just pass the debt burden to the next generation. They're offering intergenerational mortgages as a solution to the affordability crisis. Think about what that means. You can't afford a house, so your children will help pay for it. That's the plan. Congratulations, that's a creative way to describe structural failure. So where does that leave Malaysia? Let's be clear, this is still an extraordinary country. The food is world-class. The infrastructure, relative to income level, is impressive. The natural beauty, the Cameron Highlands, the islands of Sabah, the ancient rainforests that predate those in the Amazon, is genuinely staggering. English is widely spoken. The multicultural fabric of Malay, Chinese, Indian, and indigenous communities creates a richness of cultural life that is rare anywhere on Earth. Malaysia has a real story to tell, real assets to leverage, and real people who love it deeply and want it to succeed. But love doesn't pay rent. And national pride doesn't close the salary gap with Singapore. The country is caught in a bind of its own making. Structural policies that were designed for a different era are actively pushing out the talent that a modern, knowledge-based economy requires. The housing market is increasingly extracting wealth upward rather than building it across the middle, and the response has been incrementally insufficient. First, the salary gap has to be addressed through genuine productivity-linked wage reform, not just minimum wage adjustments that still leave university graduates earning $430 a month. Second, the structural equity problem has to be confronted honestly, because you cannot build a globally competitive talent ecosystem while telling a third of your population that the rules are different for them. Third, housing policy needs to shift from ownership subsidies on overpriced units to genuine structural reform, aligning house prices to median incomes, deploying the surplus of unsold units as affordable stock, building a real rental housing market with legal protections that make long-term renting a viable life choice rather than a consolation prize. Fourth, the MM2H visa program, which the government nearly strangled to death in 2021 before partially reviving it, needs to be genuinely accessible to the mid-income international residents who actually make a city vibrant, not just ultra-high net worth investors dropping $1 million into a fixed deposit. You need the teachers and the freelancers and the retirees on reasonable pensions, not just the billionaires. They're the ones who fill the cafes and join the community groups and tell their friends. Malaysia is not emptying out in the way a clickbait headline might suggest. But it is engaged in a slow, grinding, data-confirmed process of losing exactly the people it needs to make the transition from a middle-income country to a high-income one. The engineers going to Singapore, the doctors going to London, the entrepreneurs going to Melbourne, the millennials who live in rented apartments 3 hours from the city centre because that's what they can afford on a ringgit salary. The ones who stay because they love their parents and their food and their home, but who quietly know that the system was not designed with their advancement as a priority. That's the story nobody in the tourism brochures is telling you. That's the Malaysia that exists behind the Twin Towers and the ranked livability scores. And honestly, it matters. Because Malaysia has everything it needs to be extraordinary. The question is whether it's willing to do the structural work to deserve the people it's losing. So tell me, if you've lived in Malaysia, or left Malaysia, or watched someone you know make that decision, what tipped the scale? Drop it in the comments, because that conversation is worth having. And if stories like this one matter to you, you know what to do.